Hello and welcome to Newsclick. Today we have with us Professor Harry Vanden, who is from South Florida University and who has written extensively on Latin America and has also been a commentator on the recent events or the past events there. Harry, good to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be here and to be on Newsclick.
Latin America has been in the news recently. Huge demonstrations in Brazil, a vibrant left movement emerging out there which has been noticed all over the world. Quite interesting because the left in lots of other parts of the world is somewhat in retreat. Do you think the Latin American left has new things to tell the world about what's happening?
Oh, very much so. And don't forget that a few years ago we almost despaired because we thought the left was in retreat, if not submission in Latin America. But the neoliberal policy in Latin America has been so unsuccessful that it has actually become a factor in mobilizing people against then neoliberal policy, and in the process developing a new politics, a new form of participation, a greater concept of citizenship. Indeed, many of us chart this recent upsurge to the Caracazo, which was this uprising in Caracas, Venezuela in 1989 after the government, a democratic government, not a repressive government, endeavored to implement very bad neoliberal policies. And it was from that then that Chavez and his colleagues in the Bolivarian circles decided they needed to make a change, which led to the coup attempt, which led then to the creation of Chavez's Fifth Republic movement. Indeed, it was the neoliberal policies in Mexico that prompted the Zapatistas to rise up the same day that the North American Free Trade Agreement was implemented in January of 1994. So this has been ironically a great boon and has invigorated Latin American mobilization. But further, I think we should note that the Latin American left is indeed charting new waters. The orthodox parties have become much less relevant. The United States and the neoliberal Washington consensus, as we call it in the Western Hemisphere, the IMF, the World Bank, the U.S. Department of State Agency for International Development, have prompted a lot of change, or tried to, and for a while the Latin Americans, perhaps a little like folks in India, were starting to buy it, but the economic consequences just did not wash. And so after 95, after the late 90s, you get a realization that some significant change is necessary. We could look, for instance, at the uprising by the National Indigenous Confederation of Ecuadorians in 2000, when they literally just swarmed the government and took over the congressional building for one day. And of course, in more recent times, we see that after attempts to stop the upsurge of the people in Bolivia, we just have again massive mobilization, thousands of people coming down from El Alto into La Paz and demanding that the government change its policies, demanding that the president leave. And then when the vice president would not change those policies as the new president, 2 years later in 2005, they demand that he leave. They demand they have a decent and neutral interim government. They demand elections. They demand a new congressional Congress. And of course, that paves the way for Evo Morales to arrive. And he comes in with a very strong anti-neoliberal agenda and really starts to go about implementing change.
So one of the, of course, elements in this has been that Latin America entered the neoliberal era perhaps earlier than anybody else, and also a much more, shall we say, very, very predatory economic order. Yes. Chilean coup, the Milton Friedman kind of regime brought in over there, and of course that became the precursor to what rest of the Latin America was to do. Also the fact that it had really military governments in 70s, 60s and 70s, which were highly repressive, allowing such neoliberal policies to be really implemented first. So absolutely, all that has changed in the last 20 years. And do you think, in that sense, that rest of the world, which has entered neoliberal phase later, would follow the same trajectory?
Well, certainly that's a possibility. I think the rest of the world has to chart its own course, but certainly one can learn, one can study, one can see if not only the mechanisms of change, the mechanisms of participation, the enfranchisement of the masses, the redefining or redefinition of citizenship, to include then the hithertofore marginalized, the hithertofore subaltern. That is perhaps very significant. Some are writing that indeed this sort of neo-Marxist, neo-socialist model that's being developed in Latin America might indeed have very broad applicability. So we'll have to see. And we should note, of course, that the United States exercised and still does to a degree, a great deal of hegemony in Latin America. So indeed, they were able to push the implementation of the neoliberal policy a bit more strongly. Indeed, I spoke to the National Association of Economists in Ecuador in 1995, and there were so many of the U.S. trained economists there, and of course representatives of some of the government agencies, U.S. government, Ecuadorian government, and they were saying, of course, there is no alternative, one must go along. Well, indeed, that proved not to be the case. Indeed, the Latin Americans have developed their own alternative, and one that seems to be working fairly well for them. Yes, neoliberalism was able to have some success in Chile after very repressive policies against the workers and so many others, but even the successes in Chile could not be replicated easily elsewhere, and generally the neoliberal policies have been a significant failure, particularly vis-a-vis the masses, vis-a-vis the laboring people of Latin America, though clearly some upper echelons, even some members of the middle class did benefit.
You know, if we look at countries which have been in the forefront of the Latin American left, if you will, basically Venezuela, now Ecuador, what is the ALBA axis.
Yes.
But you also have countries like Brazil, which have not been particularly at the forefront of what we would call the left reforms, but have also been fair amount anti-United States hegemony of Latin America. Do you think that all this has actually meant that the weakening of the US hegemony in Latin America in overall terms is a very, very significant element in what's happening?
Oh, clearly. Keep in mind that the U.S. wanted to replicate NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Association, on a continental scale. They wanted the FTAA, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, to encompass all of Latin America. And they tried repeatedly to push that, but ultimately they were defeated. And for a variety of reasons, not just from a leftist ideological perspective, but indeed from the perspective of national interests. And if nothing else, Brazil has a very clear vision of its national interests. Brazil, according to the Brazilians, is a land of the future, but they realize that the growth, the development that they want to chart could easily then be subordinate to the United States. So some years ago, even before we had ALBA and this new alliance, we have the Brazilians with the Argentinians and later the Paraguayans and Uruguayans starting Mercosur, or Mercosul in Portuguese, the South American sort of common market, which is really a counterbalance to NAFTA and is really an attempt to build a large economic bloc that excludes the United States, because the Brazilians are wise enough to realize that indeed their national interest, even their capitalist national interest, can be compromised if the United States can dominate the whole area and filter all the trade through the United States, as indeed has happened in Mexico.
Do you also see the possibility of this hegemony being re-established? We had coup in Honduras about a couple of years back. We have overthrowing of certain governments which have taken place, virtual coups, if you will, done by, again, with the backing of the United States. Or do you think this process of weakening of the United States hegemony over Latin America is now irreversible? And essentially, America or United States is actually a weakening, getting weaker day by day. So this hegemony is not going to return.
Well, I mean, one has to see. I mean, frankly, one of the boons that the Latin Americans have experienced vis-a-vis the United States is the United States' preoccupation with Iraq and Afghanistan. Indeed, the United States was ready to send troops into Colombia to support the suppression, supposedly, of the cartels, but in reality of the cartels and of the one leftist revolutionary force that's still waging armed struggle in Latin America, the FARC. But they just could not do it. The United States has a limit on what it can do, an economic limit, a limit in its strategic resources, a limit in its strategic employment of its forces. So, and that still goes on. There's also realization that these new forms of intervention can be extremely costly in terms of economic drain, but costly in terms of lives as well. So that's sort of backed off things a little bit. But it remains to be seen, and keep in mind that it's not just the United States that gets rid of progressive leaders. The Honduran elite did not like Manuel Zelaya, even though he was one of them. He was a former landowner, but they wanted to get rid of him because he doubled the minimum wage. He made Honduras part of alba. He did a lot of things that they didn't like, nor did the United States, but they were only too happy to get rid of him. And keep in mind, we've had a new form of coup since then, and that's in Paraguay, where they call it a Senate coup, because it wasn't the Marines, it wasn't the CIA, it wasn't even the military that displaced their progressive left-wing president, but it was the Senate of all things that basically trumped up charges to impeach him, to get rid of him, to get his vision out of the decision-making seat in Paraguay.
Both sides, there are still possibilities of coups and counter-coups because there's a strong entrenched elite which actually also wants to align with the United States and reverse the gains that have been made by the left in Latin America. But what would you think are the key elements today of the left movements which have emerged in Latin America? What are the key elements that make it different from what's been going on in the past?
Well, certainly the continued rejection of neoliberalism, the continued rejection of the sort of conditionality that the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the AID of the U.S. Department of State imposed. That's essential. But I should say there is this new redefinition of, if you will, in postmodern terms, who is the subject, who is the citizen, and it's really changed. We have Bolivia, where we have a strongly indigenous country, and yet we've not had, up to Morales, an indigenous president. We have, Afro-Brazilians, Afro-Colombians, who were indeed in large part marginalized. So one of the things about the social movements and the new politics is that indeed the subalterns are starting to assert themselves. No longer will a small minority dominate politics. Indeed, some mechanisms must exist that enable then the real participation of the people. And I think there's another dimension here too that indeed expands beyond Latin America, and that is the idea that if the governed do not listen to the people will reject the government. They will go into the streets, they will go into Tahrir Square. They will then replicate 1968 in Paris on a massive scale, and I think that's different. Now, of course, some of the reality in Latin America is somewhat special because it was only after we got rid of the repressive military regimes, only when the United States started talking about democracy, or as they put it, free elections and a free market, where you have these tremendous spaces opening up. But I think once they're opened up, they're going to be very hard to close. And keep in mind that the horrors of the military regimes in Latin America have been broadly rejected. Indeed, we have truth commissions who have actually sentenced a former president in Argentina. We have a truth commission that's going on in Peru. We have another in Guatemala, where we even had UN involvement as to human rights violations, you see. So the idea that we're going to allow a brutal repression repressive state to exclude the masses, I think that's passé now. And I don't think most of the Latin Americans, even some in the military, quite have the stomach to replicate the horrors that were enacted by the military governments in Pinochet as well. I mean, they've been apart from what they tried to do through Spain. The Chileans have been bringing up Pinochet and some of his cohorts to examine what they've done. So at least in the immediate horizon, I don't think that's the case, though certainly one has to watch developments. And we know that the Latin American elite and indeed certain sectors, neoconservatives and others in the United States, can be very vicious and very willing to mobilize repressive and brutal forces to suppress popular movements. So one does need to keep an eye on it, though.
So a lot of positives need to be wary of what the Latin American elite and the United States government will do. So we need to watch what's going to happen in Latin America. But what you were saying is the people who have taken to the streets, who have got really some concessions won from the rulers, are not going to go back passively to being ruled by just the ballot box or by more repressive regimes. Thank you very much, Harry, for being with us. Hope next time you come to India, we meet up again.
Oh, thank you ever so much. A real pleasure.